Today I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing Master Alex. Welcome to the stage, and thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad Mistress Joanne talked me into it.
Let's start right at the beginning. Tell us a bit about where you grew up and a little bit about your family.
I am a native of Detroit. My family was a blue-collar family. I have one sibling, a brother, who's a year younger than I. We moved out of Detroit when I was 8 years old to East Lansing, Michigan State University. My father started at the university. He'd been out of high school 18 years and decided he needed an education. So I really grew up in the educational environment. I'm a graduate of East Lansing High, where probably 95% of the graduating class went on to college. Graduate Michigan State University. Unfortunately, like many people, with a degree that I've never functionally used, other than the paper to show that I'm trainable. My family had a religious background. They were Methodists. They are Methodists. Both sides of the family belong to the same church in Detroit. So that was where my parents met. Although, because there was a significant age difference between my father and mother, they sort of didn't really know each other until quite far along. You know, my dad was 7 years older than my mom. So that's it.
You've depicted education as being vitally important to your family. It went beyond just your father. Please tell us a bit about that.
Oh, yeah. I am a profound advocate of getting ahead by education. My father started with the intention of getting a bachelor's degree and going back into industry. He was manager of the ice cream and butter division of a dairy company in Detroit, but discovered he was being passed over for promotions because he didn't have a college degree. He got bit by the education bug while he was at university and ended up staying for 10 years and getting a PhD. He graduated with his PhD the same summer that I graduated from high school. He ended up taking a job at Penn State University and had a very satisfying career to himself as a teacher. We lived on what my mother made as a secretary, and in the 50s, that wasn't very much. But after they moved to Pennsylvania, my mother kept working to put my brother and I through undergraduate school. And then she went to college. She got a bachelor's degree and had started on a master's but never finished the master's. She became a school teacher. And we moved from the blue-collar family out of Detroit to an upper middle class family because of what education did. And it happened at a time in my life that I was able to understand what was going on. The struggles that we made because we had no money, but where it led in terms of what we became capable of doing as a family. So I strongly push education, and I'm proud to say that my current two boys succumbed to my pressure. And they both have gotten bachelor's degrees while they have been with me. They had each started college when they got out of high school. One of them ran out of money. The other one had been partying too much. So they had to get back into it. And my boy Spike, who is here as den daddy for the Bootblacks, is now working on a master's degree. Has a year and a quarter to go to finish a master's. So, yeah, I push education. It's not magic, but if you don't have it, the magic isn't going to happen. We are past the point that a person, even with just a high school education, can make it anymore. Our economy has so shifted. So I'll stop preaching this question.
What was the Don Cossacks group?
The Don Cossacks. The Don Cossacks are from the area around the Don River in the steppes of what's now Russia. And they were Cossack people. They ended up as a group prisoners of war during World War II. And they perfected their love of music, the singing of Russian folk songs and Russian liturgical music. My father was a singer, belonged to the Orpheus Club in Detroit, which was a male singing group, a large group, singing orchestra, if you will. He had a large collection of records. This is they were weird blue-collar people, because even before we left Detroit, he had all these records of opera, symphonies, and all this stuff of the Don Cossacks. And I fell in love with the harmonies and dynamics of the a cappella singing, which is what ultimately led me to becoming Russian Orthodox. I started with a Methodist family, kind of got disenchanted with Methodism and became an Episcopalian while I was in college. Very high church Episcopalian, which leads into why I stopped being an Episcopalian. I became an Episcopal priest, however. I was intending to go to med school, but the church kind of got in there and did its thing on me. And I left the Episcopal Church after having been a clergyman for 5 years over the issue of ordination of women to the priesthood. And this was back in 1974, a long time ago. I think I had bad theology about what the priest is. I was hooked on some of the same stuff that the Roman Catholic Church is still hooked on. Jesus' apostles were all men, therefore the priesthood is for men. No. I have long since gotten past that point. And of course, the interesting thing is I left the Episcopal Church. I'd had a long-standing love affair with the Russian Orthodox Church, which theologically I had become involved with when I was in college and studied Eastern Christianity. I became Russian Orthodox, got retreaded, as I say, a 2-year program of training by a number of priests in the area, because we lived a long way from the nearest bishop out here in the middle of the Midwest. And at that time, We actually belonged to the Russian Patriarchate here in the middle of 1970s. We were still directly under the Patriarch of Moscow. Not most of the Orthodox in America, but the group we belonged to did. So after the retreading, I was reordained in the Orthodox Church, assigned to a parish in the city where I still live, and served there for 18 years as pastor of that parish. And I'll let you ask the next question.
Tell us about your decision to marry at the advent of your deaconship.
That wasn't the question I was thinking was coming next, but it's... Marriage was a very difficult issue for me because I knew I was gay. I'd known I was gay since I was pre-teens. There are some ways that, looking back in retrospect, I think that becoming the Episcopal priest to begin with was a way of trying to deal with my sexuality by avoidance. I was able to voluntarily be a celibate in the Episcopal Church. I spent a bunch of time in monasteries trying to decide whether I had a vocation to become a monk. Ultimately, I decided that wasn't my path, but I sure learned an awful lot. And if you know anything about my household, one of the guiding principles is the rule of Saint Benedict, which is the guiding rule of the Benedictine monastic monks, nuns. Benedict isn't really about religion. I mean, yes, he was religious, but the Roman Catholic Church supplied the religion. His rule was about people living together in a hierarchically structured community. Bingo, what is a leather household? And it seemed to work. The long and the short, however, is if there is a gift of celibacy, I didn't have it. I was miserable. By the time I left the Episcopal Church, I weighed over 300 pounds. I was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and I was drinking a 1/5 of gin every 2 days. I was seriously depressed. And I'll tell you right up front, it's not the only time in my life I tried to use alcohol to self-medicate depression. I now understand that doesn't work. Alcohol's a depressant. Now step back off the soapbox. Yeah. I bring my own soapbox with me, so it's conveniently available. At any rate, I was very lonely. The parish I was serving at the time was out in the boondocks along the shore of Lake Michigan. During the summer, there were lots of people there. During the winter, there was hardly anybody there. I was looking for companionship in my life. The church's answer to being gay was that if you're gay, you should be a celibate, and if you can't be a celibate, you should get married. Society's answer to life was you should be married. As a child of the 40s and 50s, living in the Midwest, I had no vision of successful gay relations. I lived in a town that didn't have a gay bar most of my life because it had no bars. It was still a dry community. I knew nothing about the gay community in San Francisco or New York. never heard of such a thing. I mean, where does a kid learn this stuff? And frankly, even by 1974, and at that point I was 30 years old, you can do the math, I was born in 1944. The bio, by the way, in the program is last year's bio. I'm not 68 anymore either, and I now have 2 grandchildren. But marriage seemed to be the only alternative. However, there was a bigger push. People sometimes think that the Orthodox Church has priests who can get married. Well, that's not true. In the Orthodox Church, the priests may be married, but they can't get married. The marital status is fixed at the time you are ordained as a deacon. And so during that 2 years of retreading, part of the issue, besides testing me and making me preach week after week with a senior priest listening to what I was saying very carefully, was I also had to make a decision about the issue of marriage, and it wasn't a hard decision in a sense because I was lonely. My marriage was an arranged marriage, and a lot of Orthodox clergy still, their marriages are arranged. A senior priest said, "This woman would make a good priest's wife, marry her." And it was true for the first 3 years of our marriage. And then came the first child, and she changed. Significant postpartum depression, and when she came out of that, she was super mom. Nobody could take care of the kids like she did, and she was just a different person. The first 3 years she had been very helpful in the parish. After that, it was busy taking care of the children, and me in the parish didn't count for much. Well, it counted enough that we had a second child, but the opportunities were there occasionally. And I'll be honest, it was after the second child was born that the postpartum depression went on for about 6 months. Was sort of when I went back to having sex with guys. I'm not proud of the fact that I lived a double life for many years, but the ultimate result is that part of my life now is I'm going to be honest about who I am. I am not going to live the lie anymore. It takes too much energy, besides not being ethical. Remembering who you told what, accounting for missing chunks of time, not good. Thank God we're progressing to the point that you can be out and proud.
Well, what challenges did you face as a parish priest?
Oh, it's a very interesting profession. First, you have to be a self-starter. Because the clergy often work in isolated areas. You got to be able to figure out what are the important programs that you need to be working on. But some of the other things was working with people who often can be very cantankerous. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. And the clergyman is always supposed to be Mr. Nice Guy. And sometimes people need something besides Mr. Nice Guy, and you have to figure out how to make it work. I would say that I had an interesting path to follow. The parish that I was in at the time I left the Episcopal Church, I was the fourth priest who lasted only 2 or 3 years in that parish. There was a serious problem in the parish that the bishop's solution was replacing the priest instead of solving the problem. The guy after me unfortunately broke, and he ended up in a mental institution. The bishop finally stepped in, examined the parish, and discovered it was one person who was the secretary of the parish council that was causing all the problems. He was falsifying the minutes of the parish council. He was running a network of people that he would call to stir up trouble about stuff. And the bishop finally excommunicated the man. And that made all the difference in the world. So then I get to the parish in Jackson, Michigan, in the Russian church, and my 2 predecessors had both been suspended by the priest. They still lived in the community, and I had to deal with them and the people who were their friends in my congregation. One of the things that I learned out of all of that is you have to learn to pick your battles very carefully. You can't win every battle, and you need to pick the battles that are of ultimate significance to put your feet down. On the other things, you have to compromise and be flexible. I think a good example, while my parish was in the Russian Orthodox Church, my congregation had 3 Russian descended people in it. The rest of them were all Greeks and Macedonians, Bulgarians. We even ended up with some Ethiopians. They have different customs. The Orthodox are a collection of churches that share a common faith and liturgy, but there are differences in the style of vestments that are worn, the liturgical actions that are done. And one of the big fights had to do with the crowns that are used in the marriage service. The Russians use big crowns that look like imperial margarine crowns. The Greeks use laurel wreaths. And I think the symbolism there was beautiful because they're tied together with a ribbon. And when one of the persons in that marriage dies, the ribbon is cut, and one of the crowns is buried with that person, the other crown. Well, the predecessor priest who was trying to make these Greeks and Macedonians into Russians insisted that they had to use the Russian-style crowns. I'm sorry, but the Greek custom is a legitimate Orthodox custom. The faith didn't hinge on that issue. People are difficult to work with, but as I think most of you know, I have tried to be somebody who's approachable, easy to get along with most of the time. And it comes from having faced those kind of battles. And sometimes they were battles. Sometimes with myself and sometimes with the people, but you know.
But your journey as a priest ended in ecclesiastical court. For the benefit of the audience, would you explain what that means?
Yeah. When I was coming up on 50, my midlife crisis, if you will, was realizing that 3 of my grandparents had lived into their 90s. I was almost 20 years into a marriage that wasn't working, hadn't worked for years. And I thought, my God, there could be another 40 years of this. I'm not going to do it. And I went and found a good psychologist and told the guy right up front, I have no intention of having you attempt to cure me of being gay. I need help on what am I going to do about the fact that I am gay. And mostly it had to do with what am I going to do with my marriage. He got to teach me that I needed to grow up and take responsibility for myself and make the decisions that I needed to make for my own health and well-being. And waiting for her to kick me out was not the right way. I didn't want to be the fall guy. I didn't want to be the one that caused the problem. Anyway, ultimately, she and I separated. It didn't take long for the word to get back to the bishop. And I find it interesting, but the bishop didn't call me and ask me why. At that point, we were under a bishop in Chicago, which is a lot closer to Michigan than the bishop in New York that we had been under when I first got started. But it was still a phone call away. He called her, and she outed me to him. She outed me to my parents the day after I finally came out to her. And she did me a favor because I didn't know how to tell my parents. I kept them at arm's length for 40 years so they wouldn't find out. Only to later have my father tell me, I was so surprised when you got married, I thought you were gay. And I said, geez, Chad, why didn't you say something, Any rate, the bishop made the trip to Jackson. At least he came and talked to me face to face. I cooked him dinner. We sat down in my home, the apartment I had at that point, because she and I were separated, and we'd owned our own home, so she and the kids were still living in the marital home. And he said, I've heard this. And I had reached the point in life that I wasn't going to lie. And I said, yes, that's true, I am gay. I violated a major rule of the club, if you will. I wasn't willing any longer to hide, because there's lots of gay clergy. I was going to be open about it. Well, he went back to Chicago and drafted a letter to me suspending me as a priest, followed shortly later by a letter summonsing me to ecclesiastical court, in which I was tried by a jury of my peers, other priests, with the instruction that I was not allowed to attempt to argue the theology of whether being gay was acceptable. Kind of, what can you say? It was sort of like Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do no other. So I ended up, in the Western terminology, we would say defrocked or deposed. In the Eastern terminology, I was removed from the role of the clergy. But I'd been the guy up front for 26 years, waving my arms, and I loved it. There are parts of it that I miss, but there are whole other ways that I can minister. The archetypes I work from is the father and the pastor. And they're still there, and I'm still doing it. And people get hold of me at these conferences. I had somebody talking to me just this weekend about remembering having sat with me in a lobby at the hotel at IML, and that I had listened to him and talked to him, and that it had made a difference in his life. And, you know, hallelujah. That's where I'm at.
Well, I find that religious rituals and SM rituals sometimes overlap. How do you see that?
Well, first I would say that the church is the ultimate teacher of sadomasochistic things. I mean, we got this guy up there with a crown of thorns and blood coming out of his hands and his feet and his side. That's a little sadistic. Well, then there's Saint Sebastian with all the arrows, Saint Catherine on the wheel of fire, and then there's the celibacy issue. You know, you can't come today, you can't come tomorrow. Oh, by the way, you can't come again for the rest of your life. You know, orgasm control is one of my turn-ons because it was something I had struggled with for years, and I will tell you it's a bad thing to do for any length of time because your plumbing reaches a point where it doesn't work well, and I'm at the point at almost 70 where the plumbing doesn't work well anymore. And I think it was all those years that, you know, the church not only said that homosexuality was a sin, but masturbation was a sin. And so those parts are hard. But the ritual part, I think personally, and if any of you have heard my class on ritual, I very upfront that I think mankind is a ritual-oriented animal. Most of the major religious societies in the world have significant rituals that are part of their lifestyle. Probably American Protestantism is one of the least ritualistic, but even they have rituals. I mean, you can go to virtually any Protestant church and the service structure is going to be the same. You know, if you go to the Pentecostals or the snake handlers, you may see something a little different, but we use ritual as a way of expressing ourselves. And I think that a great many of the cultures of the world used ritual as a way of approaching God. Sometimes rituals that lead to altered states of consciousness. I mean, look at all of the images on Mayan ruins of people piercing their tongues and their penises. I don't know what the women got to pierce. The images are all men. But altered consciousness. Some of my best flying in SM scenes have been piercing scenes. That is something that really works for me. Yeah, big secret, by the way. I really am a switch. The masochist in me is maybe just a little stronger than the sadist is. They both like to play. So I like piercing people, but I love getting pierced. The rituals, are things that help us get into the right frame of mind. But I personally also think that ritual helps to mark the events of our life as being important, significant events. And so I think the things that we do around issues of collarings, contract signings, those kinds of things that are the parts of our lives in regard to at least the master-slave community are very important, and they need to be done in a way. They're not casual. They're changing people's lives. And so you want to mark it as something that's important. And our religious rituals are supposed to be about things that are changing our lives because they're changing our relationship with the divine. And I'll go even further to say that I think that S&M is an equally valid way to approach the divine. Much of the church practices of asceticism were ways of using mortification to approach the divine, to open yourself to the Spirit. And in good S&M play, and we all know it doesn't happen every time, but every now and then that window opens and we have transcendent experiences, and they are overwhelmingly beautiful when they occur. And I think that the ascetical practices of the church and the ascetical practices of S&M are two parallel pathways that are headed to the same place. I suspect that means that God, whatever God is, probably isn't exactly what the churches tell us that God is. I still believe in God. I'm not sure I believe in the church anymore. But I'm very unclear now of what God is. It certainly isn't an old man sitting on a throne somewhere. I've spent a lot of time looking at Buddhism and Hinduism as old religions who have very different views on the issue, and that's helpful. Next.
In your opinion, what makes someone a very good master or slave?
I think at the root, a master is good when he or she provides opportunities of service. And the slave is good when the slave is working from the need to serve. It's not what we see in the jack-off fiction. And yeah, I mean, the fiction is great, but I don't think it's the reality of what makes our lives work, especially in the 24/7. The reality is our lives are more about doing dishes and the laundry than they are about hours spent in the dungeon. We all wish that there was more dungeon time and less dishes and windows and stuff like that. But the real reality, and I'll be honest, the place that I have failed the most as a master is providing the opportunities of service. I am a very independent person, and it's way too easy for me to just go and do it myself instead of asking my boys to do it. And I say ask as opposed to order. I try to not order. I learned from my father, please and thank you. But if my brother and I didn't do what followed the please, we would then be told that wasn't a suggestion, that was an order. I think we can be civil to one another, and please and thank you are part of being civil. Our slaves are, speaking as a master, our slaves are some of the most valuable assets that we have. And you treat your good assets well. Masters who get off on treating their slaves badly disturb me. My experience is that many submissives have self-esteem issues to begin with. And to tear someone down instead of helping to build them up is not going to be fruitful in the long haul. I want slaves, well, the reality is I want staff rather than slaves. You know, Master Stephen, the international master with the Victorian household, he and I are in agreement. We want staff to run the downstairs in our Victorian mansions. But I want slaves who are going to be able to take care of my household. I don't want to tell somebody you can breathe, you can go to the bathroom, whatever. I mean, that may be fine during a scene, but day in and day out, slave masters' protocols would not work for me. I have the place where my own mind is working, and I don't want to be interrupted every time a slave comes into a room to go through the rituals of greeting and of exiting and all of that. Come and quietly replace my drink or fill my coffee cup and slip away like the people in kabuki theater that we all pretend we didn't see. I mean, this works well for me. But ultimately, my slaves are going to inherit my property. My trust already provides. That's part of my job as a master, is to provide for them when I am no longer here. Already we know that one of my slaves, he's not a slave, he's a boy. Make it very clear that my boy Nick probably doesn't have a slavish bone in his body. And he is going to be the master when I am gone. And the two of them will inherit the bulk. My children will get some of the money, but the house, the furnishings, the toys will all go to my slave and my boy. Because I think we have to be responsible. If our relationships work, which is of course the goal that we announce, that it's going to be forever, then we have to deal with the reality of sickness and death. And you got to be sensible about it, people. It's not easy. I had a slave die. I know what it's like to go through that. And I also know that I'm getting old. I've faced 2 critical surgeries, one cardiac, one cranial. I'm still here, thanks be to God, but it's not going to be forever. I suppose throw in an aside. I'm HIV positive. The slave who died of AIDS. And we didn't know that he was positive. Get tested, people. 2 weeks to the day before he died, he was diagnosed with PCP. We knew what that meant. And it was too far advanced by the time it was diagnosed, and he didn't survive. We were totally unprepared. We didn't have medical power of attorney. He didn't have a will. He'd never changed the beneficiary on his life insurance. These are not good things. We managed to get some friends to come to the hospital to witness a power of attorney. And then ultimately, I had to exercise that to take him off of life support and let him go. Fortunately, his mother and dad agreed with it, but they weren't happy that I was the one that had to make the decision. And I don't ever want to do that again, but the reality is we're going to get there. Through that problem, I became HIV positive. And one of the things that helps me deal with it and get through life is saying that life is a sexually transmitted disease, and it's invariably fatal. Unless there is a rapture, and I don't personally believe that interpretation of Scripture, we're going to die. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. It's just a matter of when. So get yourself prepared, people. Get your house in order. I'm not afraid to be dead. I will admit I'm afraid of the process of dying. Pain that's not consensual and not erotic doesn't seem like a good idea. And the loss of control, that one bothers me as a dominant, to lose control. But okay, I'll step back down from the soapbox. Next.
Tell us about acquiring MAsT.
Oh, MAsT. That was an interesting experience. In 1999, I did not go to the MAsT workshop. I'm groping for the word, sorry I've lost it at the moment, but the gathering that people still talk about what happened in 1999 with the educational stuff that was going on. But in the same time frame, Master Roger Kirkman, who was the head of MAsT at that time, a former international master, and his slave were the heads of MAsT. Master Roger had seen my household website, and he asked me if I would do a website for MAsT and MAsT Atlanta. And I did. And then I went on to do websites for most of the rest of the MAsT chapters. It was something I could do. They weren't great websites, but you know, we're talking in the 90s, things were still kind of primitive in some of that stuff. But unfortunately, after the big MAsT event, what most people don't know was that while it was educationally a great event, financially it was a disaster. there had not been good budget controls, and the income did not meet the expenditures for what had been promised to the people that were the teachers of the workshops, the transportation, hotel, et cetera, and a lot of that debt fell personally on Master Roger and his slave. That was the point at which they ended up selling the International Master and Slave Contest, which had been owned by MAsT up until that point. They sold that to Tom Stice in order to raise money to help pay off the debts that they were carrying personally. It was an extremely difficult time for them, and they stopped paying attention to MAsT. And I understand. I'm not faulting them. They had bigger fish to fry in trying to keep themselves afloat with this vast group of creditors breathing down their neck. Nothing was happening with MAsT, and the people who were trying to get charters for MAsT chapters, the people who already were MAsT chapters, weren't getting any responses from them. Well, my name was on the bottom of every web page as the webmaster. So I started getting the responses from people that wanted direction, they wanted the okay to go on with what they were doing, and it was obvious nothing was happening. My boy John, the one who died, Slave John and I talked about it at long length and decided, MAsT needs to be saved, and it looks like the universe is sort of saying that we're it. We need to approach Master Roger and Slave Bill about taking over MAsT so they can deal with their problems. The negotiations were not easy. They took about 6 months. They were often rather heated because at the heart, they didn't want to let it go, and yet they weren't doing anything. But ultimately they did. November of 2000, we had MAsT turned over to us. The straight people may not understand, but MAsT started as a gay organization in the kind of image that a lot of gay groups had, that there was actual ownership of events and of organizations. And I was not the founder of MAsT by any stretch of the imagination. I and my household were the fourth heads of MAsT in its history between 1988, when Master Fred and Slave Michelle started MAsT, to 2000 when we took it over. There were 3 other heads in there. We were given no money. There wasn't any money left. A roster of a few names and some phone numbers and email addresses, and that was it. And a letter from Kirkman signing it over to us. It didn't even have access to the ownership of the the domain name. And that took some engineering through the company that was providing hosting. They were able to use their tie into the company that was providing the domain name to get it transferred to our control, because Roger and Bill wouldn't do it. It was not a pretty time. We discovered that the 14 chapters that supposedly existed, in fact, were only 7 functioning chapters at that time. The first thing that John and I did was to develop a process of procedures for how MAsT should work, and we documented it. One of the problems that had happened in the past was the use of MAsT money for personal bills. And it wasn't just Master Roger and Slave Bill. It had happened before that. And so became very concerned about the ethics of managing money that you're holding in trust. And most of those procedures are still being used, even though I turned MAsT over in 2007. I believed that I had taken MAsT as far as I had the skills and capability to do it. And we were up to about 40 chapters at that point. And since then, it has blossomed even further, and they're up around 100. I think it's a valuable organization for people to get together and talk about what it is that we do as masters and slaves. A place where people can talk about the problems that they're having. And I will admit that I think in that regard, small chapters are better than big chapters, because people get to trust each other. The big chapters are perhaps great for educational events, but it's hard to build a level of trust that you can open up and say, boy, I'm having this problem. The submissives develop that trust more easily than dominants do. None of us dominants like to admit in front of other dominants that we're having a problem that we don't know how to solve. It goes with the turf, sadly.
I would like to thank you for an amazing interview.
It's been an enjoyable experience. Thank you, and thank Mistress Joanne again for inviting me to participate. Thank you, Ms. Kendra, for providing this time slot in a hugely busy schedule. And thank you, all of you in the audience who've come to attend. Appreciate it.
Hallelujah.
Amen. We'll go ahead and we'll open the floor for questions.